Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name's Dave Cumming. Welcome to Morgan Latif Spotlight Sessions. We have a huge privilege today of being joined by Michael Zacka, whose most recent role as president of Amcor Flexibles for both EMEA and Asia, is joining us today to answer some leadership questions and give us some insights on how to manage through crisis.
Dave, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today.
Michael, if we're thinking about leadership and trust in the context of global uncertainty...
And there's a few of those at the moment.
Quite a bit. You mentioned managing financial controllables during uncertain times in one of your previous podcasts. In private equity, where cash generation and EBITDA are crucial, how can leaders maintain focus on delivering value in a time of geopolitical instability like this Iran crisis?
Well, rule one is like, don't predict the weather, right, Dave?
Yeah.
So, listen, number one, mission critical. Control the controllables brutally
right,
and clearly. So what does this mean? Separate the macro noise and focus on what's the impact of the macro noise, and make sure that the organization really doubles down on managing the controllables, such as your cost base, your pricing, your receivables, all the things that impact either working capital, therefore cash flow, or of course EBITDA. So that would be the first point.
Okay.
The second one is be really transparent to the organization, because this builds trust ultimately. In uncertain times, hiding risk can destroy your credibility as a leader faster than bad news, for example. So my experience is that teams actually can tolerate pressure if they understand the reality and the direction that the organization wants them to go, right? And that they're really clear about this. And then lastly, Dave, translate the volatility into an operational focus. So this must mean that the leader's got to convert that geopolitical chaos into just 2 or 3 simple execution priorities. Cash generation, potentially cost-based management, or around commercial management from a pricing point of view if we're in a hyperinflation situation, but really translate those crisis elements into actionable focus areas that protect cash generation and EBITDA.
Right. Okay. With pressure to show results in PE-backed companies, how can leaders effectively communicate and build trust within their teams when external geopolitical factors such as the war are impacting these supply chains and the financial forecasts?
Yeah, good question. And I think, you could ask 3 or 4 different leaders the same question and get 5 different answers, right? But mine today is that this concept, for example, of servant leadership really can play a role here. And some people confuse servant leadership, Dave, with softness.
It's bandied around a lot.
Exactly. And it's actually not that when executed correctly. What servant leadership can do is it can remove a lot of friction. So in times of a crisis, serving the team in my world means creating or unlocking the roadblocks so they can make faster decisions, take away the blockers, make clearer the priorities of the organization. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think the leader's role can shift from supporting the organization to equally clearing the path. Right. So this could be especially around addressing supply chain issues, procurement-related issues, logistical issues that sometimes happen in the types of situations we've been seeing recently. Or, for example, pricing approvals. I've seen organizations that go around in circles because the path hasn't been cleared, and they talk internally for a month around what should we do on pricing, and the cost base has already moved, right? And they've missed an opportunity to recover. So lastly, this concept of empowerment, but empowerment, Dave, only works in times of crisis with absolute clarity. So teams aren't looking for freedom alone. It's good to give that freedom and decentralize elements of the business, but within very clear and defined boundaries. So for example, a defined boundary would be if your raw materials have escalated, your transportation costs have escalated, what are the minimum boundaries around the must go and get on pricing, right? the sales teams need to understand those boundaries, as an example.
Okay, great. Thank you. If we're going into adaptation of servant leadership, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a term that I hear a lot, and it's very sort of the moment. In crisis situations, in light of current global uncertainties, including the conflict in Iran, how can leaders in both the PE and packaging sectors continue to serve their teams and to remove the barriers whilst also managing the financial impact of the crisis, such as the predicted rise of inflation and what's obviously happened with the energy costs shooting up and going through the roof?
This is a little why I sort of touched on the servant leadership topic before, and you can cast the dice here in a couple of different ways, but I think it's really critical. Again, I bring everything back to the here and now during a crisis, and that is make it very clear to the organization what are the short-term priorities. So again, I'm going to bring those back to, from my perspective, to cash generation, protecting margins and generating EBITDA. Of course, we'd like to have growth as well, but we can't always have our cake and icing as well in these circumstances. So cash generation, margins and EBITDA. Therefore, as a result of that, what the leadership needs to do is make it very clear. I talked before about clearing the path. Make it very clear on what are the 2 or 3 critical tasks around the controllables that you want the organization to focus on to make sure you're addressing the levers around cash generation and EBITDA. For example, making sure that your receivables are managed correctly, making sure that your pricing decisions, if you need to move pricing, you move it quickly with fairness to your customers, transparently with fairness equally to your customers, but that you don't lose time on that execution, because that can really eat into your financials significantly. So that would be a couple of examples. And I touched before, Dave, around this concept of empowerment. It's equally critical during these times that you make it clear to the organization around that speed is important, that speed of decision making is important, and if the organization feels there are any roadblocks that are there that are inhibiting speed, just given the timely reaction you need to take around managing working capital and sometimes pricing, etc., and or inventories, that they escalate that so the leadership can sort of get those unlocks to free the organization to keep moving forward and not lose critical time. Yeah,
absolutely.
Does that sort of make sense?
Makes perfect sense. How can servant leadership support leaders where supply chains and logistics are under significant pressure in fostering resilience and innovation?
Great question, Dave. One of the themes I like in this area is what I term as freedom with accountability. And what do I mean by this? Freedom without clarity can create chaos in an organization. And accountability with freedom can also sometimes create a little bit of a paralysis.
Right.
So what I believe that great leaders need to do in this situation is really define the non-negotiable outcomes and not overweight the organization, particularly during a crisis, with process control.
Okay.
Of course you need a balance. So give your teams, let them choose the how and what really matters, and trust in them that they can run at speed. Also, if you think about it, a crisis actually requires more decentralization in many areas, sometimes not less. So central teams also, you need to be aware, can sometimes slow down the decision velocity, if that makes sense, when the markets are volatile. So what I'm saying here is you don't let the organization loose, but you need to trust, give them the non-negotiable outcomes, and trust that they can navigate through whilst, of course, you monitor and follow up appropriately.
Yeah, empower that team locally.
Exactly. Okay. I think it's really critical.
Yeah, okay. Michael, if we're thinking about organizational culture in the context of war and the pressures on the business, in private equity where performance and financial returns are top priorities.
That they are.
Yeah. How can leaders ensure a culture of collaboration and trust when teams might feel the weight of these geopolitical uncertainties?
Okay, well, it's quite ironic, Dave, because during these really difficult periods, I think it's fair to say that culture is really stress tested.
Yeah.
And certainly not necessarily built in times of crisis. And from my learnings, one of the key things, first of all, when you look deeper into the organization, is silence can kill the trust faster than something like disagreement. Okay. So over communication in many ways is better than perfect messaging. However, over communicating with consistency,
Right.
over communicating with clarity, and certainly not changing the message day after or week after week or month after month. It's really important that the organization hears consistency. So that's the first point. The second learning I've had is that it's really important to collapse all the egos in an organization, particularly the senior leadership ones, during times of volatility. And the leaders must really actively reward collaboration, not just the results.
Right.
A pat on the back,
Yeah.
right, goes a long way. And then lastly, shared adversity, Dave, can really strengthen the culture, right, if framed correctly. For example, we're solving this together versus just piling on more pressure around the outcomes. You really have to ensure that you bring the teams along and that we're together in this on one boat.
Cool. So if we're thinking about the potential for rising tensions and uncertainty, what strategies can leaders use to foster a culture of unity and avoid the silos or ego-driven behavior that can undermine the performance of during these times of crisis?
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, it's really critical, Dave, that leaders don't confuse volatility with a strategic change. Short-term disruption should not constantly sort of reset the long-term direction. And I think during periods of crisis, what the organization is looking for is an element of stability, particularly on the strategic side. So in a sense, dual-track leadership is essential here. So what do I mean by this? Track one is the daily crisis focus and execution.
Yeah.
And sort of track two is the longer-term strategic direction and capability building, which in my view should take a second priority during some of these short-term blips. So if you sort of roll off that for a moment, then being agile, right? So agility is sort of not a reaction here. It's a pre-preparedness, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So ensuring that you have sort of strong systems around faster response times without losing the strategic coherence overall is, I think, really important in the short term. So keep the longer term strategy, of course, front and center, but don't distract the organization by prioritizing that over some of the short term actions that need to happen to navigate through the crisis period, particularly, as I said earlier, around the cash and working capital disciplines and the EBITDA delivery.
Michael, thinking about leadership at scale and long-term strategy amid crisis, in private equity, where scaling operations quickly is often essential, how can leaders maintain a long-term strategy focus and ensure alignment with external crisis like the Iran war without threatening to derail the short-term performance?
Yeah, great question. This is where, Dave, I believe, balance and focus really comes into play. So I think, first of all, it's the role of the leader to absolutely do not confuse volatility with a strategic change.
Right.
So yes, whilst there can be short-term disruption, it's mission critical that the organization doesn't use this as an excuse to go off on a strategic change. It's vital that the organization and the top leaders stay focused on that cash delivery, right? Cash is king. The EBITDA delivery, and anything else that are contributing to those key components during this shorter period. Now, at the same time, great leaders will be able to shield the organization and step back themselves and reflect, as a result of this crisis, is there a fundamental tweak that needs to be made to the portfolio, the organization structure, to be more competitive from a medium and a long-term perspective? But this should not be confused with delivering equally on the short term. So that's where the CEO or the leadership team need to be able to keep the org focus on those shorter term elements, but equally step back themselves in privacy and take that reflection. If as a result of this crisis there is a a material impact to the organization that should change elements of the strategy or the portfolio. Then they then take that into account on a case-by-case basis.
Got you.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And there was a thing at Sandhurst which was always about maintenance and selection of the aim and how leaders often get distracted, but they need to remember what the overall strategy is.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. The packaging industry faces constant change due to the geopolitical factors. How can leaders ensure that their organizations remain agile, they can execute on long-term strategies while also adapting to the immediate financial pressures and supply chain disruptions caused by this global situation?
This sort of ties back to sort of one of the questions you had earlier. So if we take the topic of agility, the agility and the power of it, I think, is unlocked by and large by the senior leadership. And I talked earlier about how unlocking some of the barriers to around faster decision making, make sure that you decentralize but with accountability as much as you can during these periods where you need agility around critical decisions, whether that be on how to manage the supply chain, what pricing actions to take. So it all comes back to having trust in the organization, giving them clear guidelines and boundaries around some of the do's and don'ts, and then allowing them to execute at speed while you still keep the appropriate element of performance tracking in place without overburdening them on unnecessary reporting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, moving on to the topic that's very close to my heart, the hiring piece. We're seeing a lot of private equity clients use periods of disruption, not just to protect value, but also to actively upgrade leadership. From your perspective, how do you approach talent assessment in a way that strengthens the business long term rather than just reacting to the short term pressure?
A great question. In fact, I think a lot of organizations and leaders lose an opportunity during a crisis to reassess the quality of the talent or sometimes the org structure.
Right.
And I say this because a crisis really reveals talent so much faster than any interview process.
Yeah.
I think there's a great opportunity to look and assess your leaders to make sure, A, that they own the solutions to the problems or the opportunities, and thus don't escalate the problems without solutions or to bring excuses. So really owning the problems and solutions to the problems, point one. So assess them against that. Also, I would say assess if your top talent can pivot towards being really focused with speed and execution on the key agenda items of managing cash and EBITDA. Okay. Thirdly, reflect and assess your talent around their capabilities to do with resilience. Now, we use that word a lot, but what do you look for? In my opinion, you look for calmness. You look for calmness in execution whilst they're under that stress and that constraint, and not just leaders who are confident in theory, for example, and think through how do your leaders communicate with that consistency of clarity. So that's the third point. The last point I have here is around, great leaders really shine in times of ambiguity. And I think the best talent often becomes visible during these times of instability. And they deliver results without overstressing the organization and by keeping complex problems simple.
Right.
So use these tools, I think, to assess and don't be afraid to upgrade your talent as a result of these observations.
Great. Thank you for that. One of the biggest risks we see in volatile markets is rushed hiring decisions that don't deliver long-term impact. How do you think about getting leadership hires right first time when the pressure to move quickly is so high?
Yes. Well, if you don't get it right first time, it costs you in the long term. You and your organization know that better than anyone. So whilst speed of hiring is critical, quality of hiring is just as critical. So then the question you ask yourself is how can you address speed and still get the quality?
Yeah.
And from my experience, addressing speed actually starts with a lot of preparation. Be extremely clear on what profile you're looking for, and be extremely clear on how you will assess that profile quickly during the interview process to see if there's a match, whether that be from a capability set, skill set, or from a cultural skill set to integrate within the organization. So knowing what you're looking for, knowing what you're not looking for before you start the process helps speed up the process, and equally helps increase the probability that when you're looking to make your choice either on the shortlist or your final candidates, that you get it right more often than not.
If I can add something to that, do you think aligning candidates to a set of KPIs would help in that situation? Being very clear before you start the recruitment that these are the KPIs which I'm going to look to measure 1 year after the hire is made. Would that help that process?
Mission critical. So when I look at a lot of the hires that I've done over the years and where they've gone extremely well, it's not just giving a qualitative document on what the job description is. It's sharing with that individual from a quantitative point of view, what will their scorecard look like? How has the business performed against that historically? What are the things that you're looking for from a lever point of view to deliver on that scorecard? So in the candidate's mind, it is crystal clear on what the expectations will be. And that equally helps them assess whether they feel this is the right organization, culture, and role for them, and that you're not just going through a high school dance looking to impress each other during an interview process.
That's right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Michael, if we think that clients that we're working with are increasingly reflecting and wanting to potentially go beyond the immediate challenge and asking how to build leadership teams that are resilient over a 3 to 5 year horizon, how do you approach building that kind of leadership depth within a portfolio?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little provocative here, Dave, because I would say try and get it right out of the gate.
Yep.
Okay. So ideally, you want a high-performing team with the right people in the right positions out of the gate. So now let's say that that's not the case. It's a bit like an engine that sometimes has a problem, right? You might have 8 cylinders, 5 of the 8 might be firing. So let's say we're in that scenario. I think it's really critical that you focus on your internal talent bench, because ideally you want to be able to promote and recruit from within.
Yeah.
So really focus on, are we building that talent bench, and is that talent bench going to be sufficient from a pipeline perspective to fully fulfill the senior leadership roles that you will have open up at some point in the future? So focusing on talent bench is critical. Within the context of that talent bench, it's also mission critical to make sure that you're doing the appropriate assessments around what are the capability gaps of your top talent, that you are working on building those capability gaps with those individuals in order to have talent ready.
Yeah.
At the same time, looking outside from time to time is an important tool for an organization to bring in either talent or a different mindset. And it comes back to what we spoke about there earlier, that really spending time around what you want and what you don't want from a candidate, so as you can be quite sure that if you're bringing in talent externally, that you are significantly decreasing that risk of failure for them and you as an organization, because it's costly on many fronts. So these would be a couple of the tools that I would suggest.
Great, thank you for that. I've got one last closing question on leading through global crisis. And that is, as we move through a period of global instability, what advice do you have for leaders on building teams that are not only resilient, but also focused on driving long-term sustainable success despite the immediate pressures?
Yeah, I'm going to think off the cuff here, Dave, 3 tools that I think have served me well. The first one is focus, because giving the organized focus and clarity is an ultimate leadership tool in itself, particularly during crisis. Why? One, it reduces noise. Okay, you reduce the priorities, and you can then really have the organization focus on execution on a lower number of priorities. So that's the first point: focus. Secondly, the DNA, the art of resilience, right? And And resilience is not just built through repetition under pressure. It's not about having speeches. It's not about having systems or habits. It's actually about having the right people in the right roles.
Right.
When you have the right people in the right roles that have sort of resilience in their DNA, this goes a long way in terms of effectiveness. And then lastly, this concept of sustainable success. And this is, what do I mean by this? This is through the lens of balancing survival equally of the short term around cash and EBITDA. And what's really, really critical here is that you use a crisis to sometimes improve your structural competitiveness. And that can be through the lens of your cost base. Back to what we talked about earlier, it can be through the lens of upgrading talent.
Yep.
Or just by managing some of your controllables better, whether it be your working capital and other areas that can impact areas like cash or your commercial disciplines on pricing.
Brilliant. Michael, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for your advice, for your insights, and for coming over and spending time with us for the Spotlight session.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.